1985, Salt Lake City, Utah. A pipe bomb in a package left outside the office of a man kills him instantly. Later that same day, a pipe bomb intended for another man kills his wife instead. The following day, a third man barely survives when a pipe bomb goes off in his car. All three victims of the same type of bomb, and the connections otherwise are unclear at first. One thing is clear, however. They're all heavily involved in the LDS Church, also known as the Mormons. I'm Art Intel, and this is the case of the Mormon Bombings. Salt Lake City is the home of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as LDS or the Mormons. The church was founded by Joseph Smith in New York in 1830 and later moved to the Utah Territory in 1847. Constant expulsions drove the church further and further west, and many of the church's practices were challenged by the U.S. government. The movement west left a trail of evidence for historians to sift through and discover in the years that followed, and created a prominent business for collectors of rare historic documents.
Because Joseph Smith lived and founded the church in modern times when pen and paper and the printing press were readily available to those with the means to acquire them, there's a large volume of documents and letters from him and many of the other early figures in the church.
Many of these early documents are in New York, where the church was actually founded, but because the church moved so often between 1830 and 1847, these documents could be found almost anywhere along the path the church took. Steve Christensen was a 30-year-old financial consultant who grew up and had two parents who were both heavily involved in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He and his wife Terry and their 4 children are also involved in the church, and Steve was an avid collector of historical documents and books related to the church.
Steve worked for Gary Sheets, who had built a successful business called Coordinated Financial Services in Salt Lake City. He was reportedly having some financial problems at the time as well. But the two families were very close. Gary's wife, Kathy, was very good friends with Steve as well.
On October 15, 1985, Steve approached his office in the Judge Building at 8 a.m. and noticed a package addressed to him in the corridor. The ensuing explosion killed him instantly and injured his secretary nearby as well. The police said the bombing looked like an assassination and immediately set up security around the church. They tried contacting associates and others tied to Christensen to warn them. Among those who were contacted was Gary Sheets. Police were dealing with at least 8 other bomb threats reported that day as well, and were very busy trying to reach anyone associated with the first victim, Steve Christensen.
Upon hearing what happened, Gary Sheets immediately tried to contact his wife and children to make sure they were aware of the situation and safe. He wasn't able to reach his wife, though. She wasn't answering her phone, but he did reach his daughter and asked her to continue trying to reach out to his wife, Kathy, to warn her.
Kathy Sheets was out for a walk, and upon returning to her suburban home in Salt Lake City, she noticed the package in her driveway. Assuming it was a delivery, she picked it up and was immediately killed by a pipe bomb hidden inside. The package was addressed to her husband, and the police now had a link and 2 possible motives for the killings. The first involved the collapse of a business venture Christensen and Sheets were involved in together. The second involved documents related to the Mormon Church. The next day, another bombing would narrow the focus and add a new possible victim to the list. October 16th, a bomb in a Toyota MR2 parked on the street goes off, and a man sitting inside the car at the time is pulled from the scene and rushed to the hospital. His kneecap was blown off, an eardrum ruptured in the blast, but he survives and is treated for his injuries. The man's name is Mark Hoffman, and this third bombing would narrow the direction of the investigation towards one suspect. Mark Hoffman had studied church history since the early 70s, traveling to various places associated with the church's origins and movements. He and his wife lived in Salt Lake, and in 1980, His wife was looking through an old 17th century King James Bible market purchase when she came upon two pages sealed together in the book. Between them seemed to be a folded letter. Hoffman, fearing he may damage the find, took the book to a professor at the local university who helped him remove the letter from between the two gummed pages. What Hoffman had discovered was a transcript from Joseph Smith's scribe, Martin Harris, which Harris had presented to a Columbia University professor named Charles Anthon in 1828.
According to Mormon teaching, Joseph Smith discovered golden plates with unusual characters which he was able to translate using a special seer stone. He translated these verbally to Martin Harris, who wrote them down, and this was the foundation of his church. This transcript, then, was very valuable to the church as it historically validated everything in the entire Book of Mormon.
The church authenticated the Anthon transcript and purchased it for over $20,000. They made a public announcement of the discovery and purchase, and Mark Hoffman dropped out of school and became a full-time historical documents collector. He was eager and was soon uncovering other historical documents valuable to the church. Hoffman had become a rock star in the LDS movement, and to show his appreciation, he also donated several documents he found to the church. But not everything Hoffman was uncovering was flattering to the church. There were many things he discovered that the church wanted to keep from the public.
It's important to understand that elders in the church act in a way that is intended to protect the history and integrity of the church first and foremost. So if someone discovers a historical document that's embarrassing to the church, they may well be inclined to decide to purchase the document just so that its contents never come to light the public eye. This is something historical document dealers know as well.
During the 1980s, the church purchased a significant number of documents and sometimes received them as donations. The church did indeed publicize many of these, but marked others as sensitive and hid them from public view. So it was possible that someone from the church attacked Stephen Christensen, Gary Sheets, and Mark Hoffman because they had information that was damaging to the church. But the investigation would uncover a link directly between Hoffman and Christensen, and later evidence that would prove to be the linchpin in the case. In 1981, Hoffman had discovered a letter from Thomas Bullock which excoriated Brigham Young, the chosen successor of the LDS Church. The letter, written in 1865, reported that Brigham Young had destroyed the actual writings of the church and that Bullock had kept a copy in safekeeping. This shed a very bad light on Brigham Young, and by extension, the LDS Church. Hoffman tried to sell the letter to the church, who balked at the asking price. So Hoffman sought to work with another sect of the Mormons, the RLDS Church, or Community of Christ Church.
The RLDS believes that the rightful succession within LDS was that Joseph Smith III should take over the leadership of the church. But Joseph Smith had reportedly selected Brigham Young as his successor, something the Community of Christ disputes. This letter gave credibility to their beliefs as it portrayed Brigham Young as very selfish.
Hoffman ultimately agreed to give the letter to the church in exchange for several historical items valued at over $20,000. As part of the agreement, the church would also have to make public the contents of the letter and embarrass itself. The next day, the New York Times wrote an expose on the letter titled, "Mormon Document Raises Doubts on Succession of Church's Leaders." In 1984, Hoffman sold what would become known as the Salamander Letter. It was purchased on behalf of the church and provided details that contrasted vastly with the original story of the Book of Mormon. In this letter, it is revealed that Joseph Smith spoke to a white salamander instead of an angel. It also made assertions about Joseph Smith's practices and motivations.
In hindsight, when you think about it, alarms should have been going off everywhere. I mean, here comes this guy, 31 years old, no one's ever heard of him, and suddenly he's uncovering historical documents of massive historical significance over and over. But if you're an elder in the church and a document comes along that proves everything your church believes and teaches and it's validated, you're probably not going to go out of your way to try and prove it's not true.
Hoffman was discovering all kinds of documents, including letters from Joseph Smith's mother and other letters from Martin Harris. He also discovered letters from George Washington, John Adams, Daniel Boone, John Brown, Andrew Jackson, and a host of other historical American figures. He later discovered the only remaining copy of the Oath of a Freeman, the first known printed document in the American colonies. Were reported to be lost long ago, but Hoffman found one. He claimed to have a full network of resources that helped him recover these documents. Something wasn't right, however, and those who wanted to ignore it probably had a reason.
There are several challenges to overcome in trying to forge a historic document. You not only need to perfectly match the writing style of the historic figure in question, but you need old paper that matches the age of the time. You need old ink from the time period that the document was supposedly written.
Investigators at the scene of the third bombing had suspicions too. The injuries suffered by Mark Hoffman did not match with his story. According to Hoffman, he leaned over to the passenger side of the car to stop the package from falling off his passenger side seat when the bomb went off. But his injuries were on his side, and his face was not damaged as it would have been had he really been facing toward the bomb when it went off. It looked instead as though Hoffman had tried to turn away from the bomb when it went off, as if he knew what was coming when the package hit the floorboard of his car. Mark Hoffman, it turns out, was the perpetuator of the bombings, not a victim, and the fatal bomb in his car went off by accident. Hoffman had a dark secret that he'd been carrying all along. He was not a master at finding and recovering highly valuable historical documents from prestigious leaders and figures in American history. He was a master forger. Hoffman was so good, in fact, he was able to fool the FBI's document forensic team. His clever techniques still amaze criminals to this day. Hoffman mastered the writing style and signatures of these figures. He found very old books and cut out empty pages from them he would use for the paper in these forgeries. He studied and mastered how ink was made in the mid-1800s and matched the recipe exactly. He used burnt ash from the same paper to falsely age the ink and used chemicals like vinegar and acids to make the print look aged after being produced. He used a vacuum to pull the ink further into the paper, making it appear aged and settled into the fibers when it was viewed microscopically.
The original Anthon transcript was actually found by Hoffman's wife. He set up the entire thing, gluing it between two pages, specifically knowing his wife would discover it while browsing through the book. He had a professor unglue the pages so that someone else could be the one who actually opened it and saw the letter first.
In instances where he produced printed documents, he used the exact same style plates that would be used by printing presses of the time. It was also important to note that Hoffman donated several documents to the church as well. These forgeries would be used as comparatives for document inspectors to validate the authenticity of other forged documents Hoffman would try to sell to the church. And because they were both fakes, they looked the same and thus would be authenticated. Despite his scheme's success, Hoffman was in deep financial debt, both from his spending habits and from purchasing legitimate documents for resale. He was desperate, and in an attempt to generate quick money, he tried to broker a deal with Stephen Christensen for what was known as the McClellan Collection. This series of documents from a prior apostle of the church supposedly provided revelations unfavorable to Joseph Smith, including allegations of adultery and polygamy, unapproved by his wife Emma. But Hoffman didn't have these documents and had no way to forge them fast enough. Stephen Christensen was about to blow the lid on Hoffman's scam, so he made 3 pipe bombs to try to prevent the exposure. The first pipe bomb was made for Steve Christensen, the only real intended target Hoffman had. He felt he needed to kill others, however, in order to send the police and investigators in the wrong direction. This was the purpose of the other 2 pipe bombs. Hoffman said in a very cold-blooded way later that he didn't care who else died, as long as the police were on the wrong trail. At first it worked. They were focused on the business relationship between Steve Christensen and Gary Sheets.
The 3rd bomb was not supposed to go off in his car, but because it did, Hoffman was exposed. The forensics at the scene of the car bombing gave him away, as it turned out.
Hoffman was arrested in January 1986 and charged with 27 counts, including first-degree murder. Prosecutors and investigators uncovered evidence of Hoffman's debt and counterfeiting operation in the basement of his home, including the plates used to forge the Oath of a Freeman. To avoid the death penalty, Hoffman agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of theft, and 1 count of fraud. Mark Hoffman was sentenced to 15 years to life, and 2 years later, a parole board recommended that he never be allowed out of prison. He has been excommunicated from the LDS Church and continues to serve his sentence as of this video in the Central Utah Correctional Facility in Gunnison. In an attempted suicide while in prison, he survived but lost the use of his forging hand. After the forgeries came to light, the LDS Church tried to correct the record, but the damage had already been done and the reputation of the church suffered. Some suggest that the church's overemphasis on history and its paranoid approach to new discoveries contributed to an environment Mark Hoffman could take advantage of. The forgeries were so good, however, it's hard to find fault in the excitement church elders had in finding authenticated documents that validate everything they had believed and taught their whole lives. What do you think? Does the LDS Church have any responsibility for what happened? Or is Mark Hoffman solely to blame for everything that occurred in this case? Let us know below in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. All references are available in the description. I'm Art Intel. Thanks for watching.